Everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Oh, good. This is my first Zoom presentation. I've been doing in-person presentations many times. One time I did it in Superior, Wisconsin, but most of the time it's in Minnesota. So as Anne said, I came from Vietnam. I grew up in Vietnam, in Saigon. And I was born during the time when the French were still not colonizing, but it was a protectorate. So protectorate the last few years. And my godfather is a Frenchman. He was pretty wealthy. He owned most of the movie theaters in Southeast Asia. Let me take it back. In Laos, Cambodia, North, Central, and South Vietnam. And so I get a different viewpoint about the French. And my father worked for him. My father, I later found out, was a member of the Viet Minh. I don't know if you know what the Viet Minh is. The Viet Minh was an organization put together by Ho Chi Minh in the 1940s, early 1940s. And the main goal is to bring back independence to Vietnam. So at that time, early 1940s, it was occupied by the French. And so for some reason, my father decided to move to the South. And that was way before, I'm just guessing because he never told us, his children, what he did. And we never asked him because we dare not ask him. His father is male in the family. So asking him difficult questions can impose him and put him in a situation where his authorities are questioned. So anyway, the French came to Vietnam first, what was called the Indochina countries. Indochina is the French word to designate Laos, Cambodia, North, Central, and South Vietnam. So I got a map here. So on the map, you see that it's gradually taken over. So this is South Vietnam, 1886. The French came in, and at that time, it was more a missionary goal. And then they decided to take over Da Nang here a few years later. So that was the beginning of the colonization. And then they moved into Cambodia. And then from there, they kept expanding into North Vietnam, Central Vietnam, and then Laos. Laos and Cambodia at that time were also occupied by Siam, which is Thailand nowadays. So France has to fight the Siamese and take the Laos and Cambodia part of the countries. So the French were pretty cruel. They rule and intimidate by beheading or hanging or having the firing squad execute them. And this is the various facets of Uncle Ho or Ho Chi Minh. You can see that he looks different in all of these, but actually he started as a patriotic person. He went to France, he went to Moscow, he even came to the US and worked as a baker in New York City. So mid 1940s, this is Ho Chi Minh. And guess who these people are? They belong to the former OSS and now called the CIA. And they are here in North Vietnam to train Ho Chi Minh's troop to fight the Japanese. So this is the Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh started the Viet Minh so that they could get trained to fight the Japanese. And it was funny that when the Japanese surrendered to the US, the Japanese army did not go back to Japan. They stayed in Vietnam because they're Asian, so they can mix in. And why did they stay? They stayed to train Ho Chi Minh's troops, the Viet Minh, to fight the French and the Americans. So, Ho Chi Minh Trail. You have heard a lot about the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this is the Ho Chi Minh Trail at the beginning of the Vietnam War. Before that, they used the same transport bicycle to transport equipment and weapons to fight the French. So 1954, they had the last battle against the French in Dien Bien Phu, which is in North Vietnam, not too far from the border to China. So the French lost the battle and surrendered. So the whole army of France, probably mostly airborne, and my brother and I found a field jacket that belonged to my father, and it's airborne, French airborne. So from there, we guessed probably he belonged to the French airborne. So between French airborne and Viet Minh, they contradict. So we don't know the reality. So anyway, this is the map of Vietnam with the inland. This is the inland Ho Chi Minh Trail. And it started from south of Vinh, which is the center of the troisième military zone military. The third is like the 1 corps, 2 corps, 3 corps in Vietnam. But in Laos, there were 5 corps. And this is the 3rd corps. It happened that one of the commanders of the Laotian Royal Lao Army lived in the Brooklyn Center in Minnesota, and he's a close friend of me. So from him and from the CIA, we call them the case officers. So one of the main CIA case officers in Laos was also a close friend of him. So there we found out that there's a lot of confusion among the lowland Lao and the Hmong. So Kirk, you're in Wisconsin, you might have heard a different version from the Hmong about them controlling the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is this line here, which is impossible if you look at the Hmong. This is where the Hmong operated. I mean, in Laos, sorry. So this is zone number 2 that belongs to General Vang Pao. So this belonged to Royal Lao Army. And then the 4th military region is down here, also is controlled by the Royal Lao General. And the capital is Luang Prabang. Here, Luang Prabang is zone number 5, the kingdom. And the last one is zone number 1. I mean here, zone number 1. So the white part is Vietnam, North Vietnam, Central Vietnam, and South Vietnam. South Vietnam, are you still there? Hello?
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
here.
we're here.
You
We're
blanked out.
Yes,
So-
I just turned my video off so I can hear you better.
Oh, okay. So South Vietnam during the war includes Central Vietnam. And this is the 17th parallel that divided North from South during the Vietnam War. During the French War, there were North Vietnam, Tonkin, about this big, and then Central Vietnam was Annam. It was a long land, and then South Vietnam was down here. That was under the French colonization. You might be wondering about this red line here. So this red line is the actual land Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was the sea Ho Chi Minh Trail that not many people talked about. So they used fishing boats to transport equipment like guns, cannons, and ammos from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos stopped here and turned into the Sihanouk Trail so that they can transport the equipment and troops all the way down to the Mekong Delta, which is down here. You have heard of the Mekong River that started in China, goes through Laos and Vietnam up here, and then Cambodia and South Vietnam down here. And so this is the Mekong Delta. The richest area in South Vietnam. So this is the actual Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. And here is another closer look at the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, starting from the Lao-controlled zone number 3, and then zone number 4, also controlled by a Royal Lao General. And then after it crosses into Cambodia, it turns into Sihanouk Trail. So Sihanouk is the name of the prince, the last prince of Cambodia. This is a picture of the map from the, so probably Kirk, you must have heard of the SGU, the Hmong Secret Guerrilla Unit. They are very strong in Cambodia, in Wisconsin. So this is number supposedly 1 up here and 5 down here. Yes, yes. So this is 1. This is zone number 5. This is General Vang Pao's zone number 2. And the green part is my friends, zone number 3, with the beginning of the Ho Chi Minh Trail inland. And that goes into zone number 4. We had a lot of American troops. So this will tell you some of the units. And then if you look at the picture behind me, these are some representing the American troops. These are real shoulder patches. So these are the other allies, including Australia, the Philippines, the Korean, Taiwan. This is an actual Taiwanese medal. So these are the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese medals. And these are representing the units in the South Vietnam Army. So that's also what I put together to make the cover of my books. This is 2 medals. It was nominated in 2020 among the top 6 best books in military history, International Book Awards. And the other one is The War. You see that it's thicker, almost 500 pages long. And this is from the picture that you see behind me. So what did we do to control the Ho Chi Minh Trail? So the South Vietnamese, the Royal Lao Army, and the CIA bombarded the trail using Super Fortress B-52 almost every day. So my friend, my first girlfriend, when I was a young teenager, her big brother was the first SEAL officer. It was experimental. So the Americans, based on the commandos that fought in against the Japanese in the Pacific War during the World War II, so experimented with the frogmen, that they swim like a frog. So they were the ones giving the idea to the MACV SOG special forces to create this, probably, they were not called SEAL yet. So the brother was a lieutenant and platoon leader who do jump, like parachute jumping into Laos to install listening device so that when they hear noise of the divisions being moved on the trail, then they would bring in the B-52 to bombard it. So imagine that the trail was bombarded during the day. So at night, the North NVA. So when you hear NVA, you know that they are from North Vietnam Army. During the night, they will reconstruct it so that it can be used the next day. This is, you have heard of the word Vietnamization. So it caused a lot of confusion because, and then the South Vietnam Army and the government didn't like the word because it gave people the idea that South Vietnam could not defend itself, that has to rely on the Americans and allies. But we had a good army, conventional, professional army, since the French were still in Vietnam. So the Paris Treaty, 1968 was the start, the Tet Offensive, one of the three offensive, NVA, North Vietnam Army, and the VC. So V stands for Viet, C stands for Communist, VC. Brag that they want to claim that they are the South Vietnamese rising against the South Vietnamese army. So because of that, then it was very difficult to tell, even for the Vietnamese, who the VC were and who the civilians were, because they all look alike. So that was the first, probably the first guerrilla war that we had, major guerrilla. And so guerrilla war was imported from Cuba. And then, of course, there were a lot of Cuban advisors that to give advices to North Vietnam and to the VC. So 1968, after the Tet Offensive, then gave Nixon and Kissinger the idea of talking. And then Walter Cronkite visited the battles in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive, came back and declared that the only way to withdraw from Vietnam would be to negotiate. And so that was the birth of the Paris Accords negotiations. And it took a few years from 1969 until 1972 for the Paris Accords to be finalized. So the problem is that President Nixon did his best. Whatever the North Vietnamese demand, he would bend, he would give in. It was a disaster for South Vietnam. So imagine that when you negotiate with an enemy and you said all of your military aids from the US will be cut. In the meantime, Kissinger, Secretary Kissinger agreed with North Vietnam to allow them not just to continue to receive aids from Cuba, the Soviet, and China, but also that they are allowed to keep all of the territories that they took. So that was the beginning of the end. So I was drafted to bring our army of 800,000 before 1973 to bring it up to 1.5 million. This is me as a lieutenant. So I found out that the picture was taken in 1974 that I gave my parents so that they would use in case I'm killed in action for my funeral. So, of course, we were spoiled receiving equipment from the US, good weapons, good helicopters. We were supposed to be the 10th largest air force in the world. We had plenty of helicopters. Everything moving troops depend on helicopters. We got good tanks. So at that time, we used the it's pretty old now, the M46, M44 tanks, and we received the more advanced tanks from the U.S. Army. Good rifle, M16, which is now called M4, still used by the U.S. Army. But you have no supplies, you have no ammos. I know that because I was in charge of training the troops to protect the Saigon. I was training the protected the Saigon how to shoot M18, which is the bazooka. Why do we have to use the bazooka that was used during World War II by the French? Because we ran out of anti-tank M72. And then we had to dig out from our stockpile from the French the ammos for M18 rifle, I mean the bazooka. Out of 10 shells, maybe if you are lucky, 6 would explode, and the rest of the 4 remaining are dead. So if you are attacked by the tanks, enemy tanks T-54, and then you pull the trigger, and your bazooka didn't do anything, what would you do? You cannot just put it down and run. You have to hold it and count 1001, 1002, 1003. You count but to make sure that the shell is completely dead before you put it down. So it was devastating for our troops, and it was very devastating for me because I realized we are running out of weapons. I mean, out of ammos. So that's why we lost the country. The boat people, when you hear boat people, you know they are Vietnamese. They keep running, escaping like I did, as I said, in 2 minutes. So actually, my boat was pretty close to this one. Probably 60 feet long, maybe. So anyway, there were about 62 people on the boat, on the upper and the lower deck. And this is my route of escape from Saigon to this is the Gulf of Thailand. So we were lucky we found a boat, and we went out looking for the 7th Fleet, and we couldn't find it. And you have seen pictures of helicopters being pushed off from battleships. So those are the 7th Fleet ships. we couldn't find the Seventh Fleet, so we came back to Cambodia. And at that time, the Khmer Rouge were executing. They killed from 3.5 to 6 million of their own people. So we had to hide, not in this little bay here, because of the monsoon season. And it was at night, and we heard people crying from Cambodia. And then we dare not stay. We would rather face the monsoon rain than storm. So we headed out back. So that is the second, the light green line here. And we were looking for a Thai boat, fishing boat. So we found a Thai fishing boat, and most of the, it said that but between 30 to 40% of the boat people were killed or capsized at the sea. So we looked at the Thai boat that approached us, and we saw that they had a Buddhist altar in the cabin. So we hope that it's a real Buddhist group. It means they don't kill. Buddhist people don't kill. So anyway, we boarded that boat, and that is the dark green line here. So we kept circling, and we almost reached Thailand when the skipper said, "Oh, I cannot take you inside my country because they will put me in jail for smuggling people." So he turned around and took us back to Vietnam. So that's this line here. So we decided to commandeer the boat. And then the boat took us to Patani, which is a small fishing town. It's actually a city. Now it's a city with a lot of tourism. So the Thai government was so scared that Vietnam would attack Thailand next. So they lured us to board a Vietnamese boat. So the blue line to go to Singapore, because the Americans were picking up refugees in Singapore. So we finally realized that it was a lie, because the Americans had nothing to do with Malaysia. So anyway, we were stopped by the Malaysian Coast Guard, and we were put on an island, which is supposed to be a refugee camp, but we lived like in a prison. So I'm lucky to find a photo of the island. And this is a boat of refugees that was caught by the Malaysian Coast Guard. You see these rocks here? When I was there in the camp, every day I would go swimming, looking towards mainland to see if somebody would find us. And then I would be sitting on top of these rocks. Finally, Secretary Robert McNamara admitted that the reason used by LBJ, President Johnson, to start the war in 1963 was made up. It was a lie. It never happened. USS Maddox, the battleship of the US Navy, was never attacked by torpedoes, boats from Hanoi. So the war explored many of the information like that from the letters that Ho Chi Minh sent to President Truman to beg him to help negotiate with the French to give independence to South Vietnam. So actually, the U.S. gave, Ho Chi Minh got independence for North Vietnam back in 1945 already. And then the French started to give independence to Laos and then Cambodia. The only Indochina that still did not have independence was South Vietnam, Cochinchina. Annam, also Annam, which is a buffer. So I thought probably it would be not too difficult for President Truman to negotiate, but the letters disappeared. Many reasons that I found pointed out that somebody really want to have a big war in Vietnam. So after the Treaty of Paris was signed, I joined the army. This is my platoon in boot camp. And these are the main authors of the Paris Accord. Secretary Kissinger and his counterpart is Le Duc Tho from North Vietnam. South Vietnam and the National Liberation Front, which is representing the VC, was just tokens. So Kissinger agreed on everything that Le Duc Tho requested. So both of them were offered the Nobel Prize, the Peace Nobel Prize. Le Duc Tho refused to take it. Kissinger went to receive it. New life in Minnesota. So this is my ex-wife and I. We were offering about 200 meals to the church that sponsored us in 1975, the University Baptist Church, across from U of M. So we were talking with a news reporter. I give credit to the person who is worshipped in this temple. He came to South Vietnam from North Vietnam to annex Cambodia, part of Cambodia, to become the new South Vietnam 1,000 years ago. This is in exchange for our princess who married one of the princes of Cambodia. So anyway, people worship him because everything that he predicts from his prophecies turned real. He was the one who gave predictions what I should do during the war to escape. He kept saying, go west, go west. And that is my current wife. She's also a teacher for Minneapolis Public Schools. In the war, I used 3 psychology. The reptilian brain, the Daniel Goleman. So if you see something that strikes you, you take a picture of it. Another psychology called the snapshot. And the picture is registered in the reptilian brain. That will surface whenever something similar appears. The second psychology is Maslow pyramid. We use this in school to monitor children, to see if they are adapting to the environment. So this explains how the Vietnam veterans were doing. Not just Vietnam veterans, but probably any veteran who came back from the war, readjusting society. Do they feel comfortable? Are they well received? It applies to all of us. How are we doing in our life? If we are happy, then we can achieve all of the levels up here. And if we are not happy, then we rebel. So after I retired, I've been working more with the Vietnam vets. We're trying to push for bills. We do lobby with the Congress. And I worked with the Allied veterans and also with the American veterans. We've been back. And if you go to Vietnam now, you will think that everybody is happy. My younger brother is still there, and since 1983, he's been giving rides like a Uber taxi, but instead of a taxi, a car, and he does it on his motorcycle, scooter. So that is the end of my presentation. Do you have any question?
Thank you for speaking with us today, and really so much information for me. Thank you so much for presenting it. I know that you have so much knowledge. To get it into such a short time frame is difficult.
Yeah, I spent about 10 years on research and then writing the books. So it's a very complicated war. And the problem is that it was reported back to the American people with more spices, more made up things.
Yeah.
And then I cited many of the situations, many of the cases in the war. And one more thing, there's a general who defected from North Vietnam, who went to France. His name is Bui Tin. We are lucky to have Dr. Stephen Young, who lived in Minnesota, and he was part of the embassy personnel. So he interviewed General Boutin in France. So Boutin said that Hanoi was about to surrender. So the B-52 bombarding Hanoi, the last one was called the Linebacker 2. That was also nicknamed Christmas bombing during Christmas 1972. So they were devastated. North Vietnam was going to surrender. but the U.S. gave in at the Paris Accord. So agreed with North Vietnam on all of their conditions. So that's the news. Bhutan was in charge of the Hanoi newspaper.
Yeah, Karen, your mic.
So what happened to your father?
My father, I don't know if you've seen a cyclo, like a tricycle that you push, you pedal, and you push to give rides to people for a living. So after the fall of Saigon, then that's how he make a living for the family until he died of pneumonia.
Okay,
So in the book,
he wasn't put in prison for his work with the U.S.?
no, he never worked for the U.S. He was with the Ho Chi Minh's group called the Viet Minh, and he found his ID, membership ID.
Okay.
So my brother told me that he tried to use the membership ID to see if he can get any grace or favor from the new regime in Saigon. So they said, you betrayed us. They told my father that you betrayed us, you went to work for the French.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
So instead, they made him go to the labor camp. A labor camp means you have to bring your own equipment, your own food, and you volunteer for 3 years. If you survived, then you'll be released. So he was old and he wouldn't survive it. My younger brother went in his place for 3 years. So the government in Saigon promised he would be exempted from the military draft if he served 3 years in the labor camp. And after 3 years, he came back to Saigon, and the government in Saigon said, you are not going to be exempted from the draft because your brother defected to the US.
Wow.
Oh,
So
boy.
he served 3 years in the army fighting the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia until the end. So within 1 year, they were able to get rid of the Khmer Rouge. And that's why a lot of the Cambodian refugees here think it is, I'm trying to be sarcastic, but the truth is that my students, when I taught the ESL to the adults during evening classes, really appreciated the communist army because they protected the civilian Cambodian against the Cambodian Khmer Rouge.
Interesting.
Wow.
So-
we're a little over our meeting time. Are you